It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Live today from the Greene Space, our ground floor theater here at WNYC, as we do about once a month with an audience here of about 100 people. Thank you all for coming. Before we get to our first guests, let's see who's here. Let's tell everybody in Radio Land and everybody on the stage who's here. Applaud if you're from Manhattan. Makes sense. Theaters in Manhattan. Easy place to get to. Applaud if you're from Brooklyn. Any other borough? New Jersey is not a borough. And did you think I was going to leave you out? Applaud if you're from New Jersey. And from anywhere else, including Nassau, Westchester, Russia, or anywhere else in the world. How many of you were from Russia? Never mind. How many of you criminally bought your way into college? How many of you legally bought your way into college? How many of you, serious question, consider yourselves democratic socialists? A few. The people on the stage wanted to know if they're allowed to applaud. I'm sure. But they didn't. They're in front of microphones. At this time of day, I imagine we have many retired people in the audience. So how many of you here right now are on Medicare? Of you, how many prefer your Medicare to the private insurance you had before you started on Medicare? And prefer, there's no right answer. How many of you are less happy with Medicare than your past private insurance? Okay, interesting. So mostly Medicare, not all, small sample. How many of you consider democratic socialism to mean we should not have a capitalistic society? Just your interpretation of what democratic socialism means. Does it mean we should not have a capitalistic society? Did that question stump you? How many of you think democratic socialism does not mean we should not have a capitalistic society? All right, I see smiles on the podium, which means people think you sort of like get it. So it may surprise many other people to hear what New York City's most famous new democratic socialist said about this over the weekend. Here is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at South by Southwest.
When we talk about ideas, for example, like democratic socialism, it means putting democracy and society first instead of capital first. It doesn't mean that you put other things last. It doesn't mean that the actual concept of capital as a society should be abolished or anything like that. But it's a question of our priorities.
So, interesting. Last one, I promise. How many of you think of democratic socialism as mostly being a politics of aiming left as opposed to aiming right? Well, at South by Southwest, AOC framed it more as the politics of aiming high rather than aiming low. Listen.
It feels like moderate is not a stance, it's just an attitude toward life of like,
Well, don't hold back. Tell me how you really feel about incrementalism.
But here's the thing that upsets me is that we've become so cynical that we view or we view cynicism as an intellectually superior attitude. And we view ambition as youthful naivete. When we think about the greatest things we have ever accomplished as a society have been ambitious acts of vision. And the meh is like worship now for what?
AOC with Brianna Gray from The Intercept at South by Southwest. The greatest thing we've ever accomplished as a society. Things have been ambitious acts of visions. So what are we capable of today?
We are capable of saving the planet, of guaranteeing healthcare as a right, of educating our children through college. We are capable of establishing all work as dignified, of respecting people's cultures, of having an economy that not only welcomes immigrants, but needs immigrants because we are being so productive. We are capable of all of these things.
So, AOC in Austin. With me now here in the Greene Space, three leaders of the new Democratic Socialism movement here in New York. Sean McElwee, contributor to The Nation and co-founder of the group Data for Progress, which calls itself the think tank of the future of progressivism. Sarah Leonard, executive editor of the criminal justice-oriented news site The Appeal. When I moderated a Bernie versus Hillary supporters debate in 2016, she was one of the Bernie supporters. Remember that?
I do.
And Waleed Shahid, communications director for the Justice Democrats, a group working within the Democratic Party. Their description on their Twitter feed says, "We helped elect AOC because it's time for a Democratic Party that represents its voters, not just corporate donors. The political revolution is here." So now you know what they're all about, more or less. Thank you all for being here. And please welcome our guest. And just to get some terms straight first, do you all identify as democratic socialists?
Yes.
Yes, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sean, yes.
I brought my DSA card with me.
A DSA card. Waleed.
Never be without it.
The thing that Congresswoman said in the first clip, democratic socialism means putting democracy and society first, not that the actual concept of capitalistic society should be abolished. Who could flesh that out for our audience? Sean, maybe you want to start, and our listeners a little bit. If a real progressive has a chance in 2020 and the movement wants broad acceptance in general, maybe it's important for what that means to be really clear.
All right. I have to speak slowly so I don't end up accidentally swearing. I would say that the sort of goals of the movement, you have like the sort of longer term goals, and then you have the more immediate goals that could be accomplished within 5 to 10 to 15 years. So something like Medicare for all is an idea that we could accomplish within our lifetimes. We have a program that is called Medicare. It covers a large and growing share of the American population. It's not impossible to imagine expanding that system to cover everyone. And that is a clear political goal. We have a climate crisis that requires an immense mobilization that is going to require large investments of government spending, and also I think in many cases direct government intervention in the economy, direct government control of which resources go where. We have massive companies like ExxonMobil that on their balance sheets and priced into their stock market price of their company are assets in the form of fossil fuels that we know cannot ever be burnt. All of these are problems that simply cannot be solved by markets. What the goal of, I think, democratic socialists is to increase the share of resources, decision-making in the economy that is controlled by democratic means rather than simply by individual people who tend to be disproportionately men, disproportionately white, disproportionately incredibly wealthy, obviously. And those are the things that are in our minds. Me and Waleed spend a lot of time how do we elect more progressive Democrats? And those Democrats, when they talk to voters, are talking about these sorts of questions, these sorts of very concrete policies that people can understand. And that is sort of the way that I approach these issues.
So let me bring Waleed into it next. And thank you, by the way, for your restraint in helping us maintain our FCC license. Waleed, how about the not for the actual concept of capitalistic society being abolished part?
Yeah, I think a lot of those kinds of terms are red herrings. I don't think anyone is calling for the complete abolition of, not having a Hershey's bar at your bodega, for example, or anything like that to eliminate consumer goods. But I think what democratic socialism is more of a critique of the current capitalist system and a smarter way of thinking about how the economy can grow and provide for all workers, not just for people at the top. So right now, we have the 3 richest men in this country own more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans combined. 60% of Americans can't afford a $500 emergency medical bill. The wealth and income keeps getting stacked at the top 1%. Life expectancy last year declined in America, a trend not seen since World War I when we had a flu pandemic. So if capitalism is going fine, these things wouldn't be happening. There's something wrong with the system, the way the economy is being run, the way the markets are being run, and the best example of this is the fossil fuel industry. This is what happens when you just allow markets to run free, to not be restrained by government intervention, by alternative ways of thinking about how the government could provide not only for the planet but for workers. So and then one last thing I'd like to add is that a lot of these ideas, democratic socialism, social democracy, liberalism, these terms are kind of been interchangeable a lot in U.S. history, in European history. And there are large books about the debates between these theories. But at the end of the day, these concepts, as you said earlier, are not necessarily new. FDR talked about the right to health care for all Americans. Harry Truman introduced a government-run insurance program in the 1940s. Democrats have been talking about single-payer health care for basically most of the century. So when AOC is talking about why not now, it's not like these concepts are new. People have been talking about this for a long time. So I appreciate the urgency she's bringing to the debate.
Right. And Sarah, Bernie Sanders does identify as a democratic socialist. Elizabeth Warren says she does not. When Warren announced her breakup, the big tech companies' antitrust proposal last week, she framed it as a strike for true competitive capitalism, not an act of socialism. Are you enthusiastic about that?
I think it's a great starting point. I will take it. During the New Deal, socialists famously joked that they're trying to save capitalism from itself, and capital wouldn't let them. And that appears to be what's happening right now. As both Sean and Waleed said, the system is obviously not working. And in fact, the ways in which it has increased radical inequality has created enemies of the system as it stands, and has proved a rallying point for the left, for people who want to regulate these companies, for redistribution, for what we're calling democratic socialism. And I think, something that does distinguish democratic socialism from all these other terms is that it does give you a kind of ambitious North Star in a way that, just being a Democrat does not. So when we talk about democratic socialism, in the long run, we hope for not just greater equality, but an expansion of democracy out of this narrow realm that we currently consider political, which is the voting booth or electoral campaigns, which are very important. But can we have more democracy in day-to-day life? Can we have more democracy in our workplace? Can we democratize the economy, which is where we spend much of our time in our lives? And so I think having that sort of ambitious vision of greater freedom in society is something that does distinguish democratic socialism as an idea.
It's interesting that you put it in terms of ambition, as the Congresswoman did at South by Southwest, right? We played the clip in which she identified democratic socialism as aiming high rather than meh. We're capable of establishing all work as dignified. Remember, the clip said capable of saving the planet, respecting people's cultures, and that needs immigrants because we're so productive. And that's really interesting to me. And what you just said is really interesting to me, because some people consider socialism a flattening of ambition, like guaranteeing minimums for all, not much upside reward for being really successful. Do you think that's a stereotype that centrally needs to be busted?
Yeah, I mean, that, a flattening is not how I think of socialism at all. Flattening is what's happening now, where people spend all their time at work, and as Waleed pointed out, the vast majority of people are falling down to the same level of just getting by, and just a few people are rising to the top. That's like a pretty flat society with a few people at the top having a really great time. And I want to, speak to what she said about moderates, because there's a reason that our most famous moderates in this country are billionaires. Our very own Michael Bloomberg is a very famous moderate, and he's a billionaire. Howard Schultz is a billionaire moderate. And the reason they can be moderate is the system is working super, super well for them. So when they get into this race, they're afraid of their taxes being raised. Howard Schultz said that right out. And you've never heard of a moderate working class hero, because people who are actually suffering, for them, radical change is not some sort of abstract idea. It's an obvious necessity. And so I think when we talk about moderates, we're often talking about people who are not just holding some sort of intellectual position, but have a big material stake in things staying exactly the same.
Now, listeners, we can take phone calls for our three guests as we talk about democratic socialism in America in 2019. Sean McElwee, co-founder of Data for Progress; Sarah Leonard, the executive editor of the news site The Appeal; and Waleed Shahid, communications director for Justice Democrats. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. An audience here in the Greene Space, raise your hands and we'll come around with a microphone. For either of you, Waleed, maybe you, on moderation just being meh, and Sarah was just talking about the billionaires like Howard Schultz. NBC News is reporting this morning that Schultz, who of course was the Starbucks founder running for president as an independent, will promise not to nominate a Supreme Court justice unless he or she can be confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate, not just the 51 votes required now, or not even the 60. That's the normal filibuster buster. And he will vow not to sign any legislation that does not have bipartisan support. Additionally, he said he'd assemble a diverse cabinet of Democrats, Republicans, and independents and create an independent commission to replace gerrymandering. Now, he would argue, I'm sure, that that's hardly meh. What that is pulling us back from the polarization that's tearing the country apart. Any reaction to any of those ideas, Waleed?
Yeah, not only does Howard Schultz have a fringe economic ideology, he also has a fringe political strategy for how things should be accomplished to solve crises that working families are going through. Everything that you just said is much less likely to happen than Medicare for all. So I would like to start there. The other thing about just Howard Schultz is that I think that Sarah's right, that there is this tradition of politics that used to be seen in people like Bill Clinton and Joe Biden is increasingly not in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, that the center of energy is with people like Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. And just, in the 6 months that Alexandria's been elected, she's shown how much a Democrat who's willing to fight for big ideas, to really go to war with not only Republicans, but members of the billionaire class, that you can widen the political realm of possibility so much by just fighting for these things. When was the last time you saw a Democrat go on CNN, go on public radio, go on MSNBC to talk about raising taxes, marginal tax rates on multimillionaires to 70%?
Sean,
I can't think of anyone.
Not to 70%, but raising marginal tax rates on millionaires, yes.
I see the problem in American society is that the sort of inputs of democracy in the outputs don't really align anymore. Someone noted yesterday that AOC, the entire time that she's been alive, the Republican Party has won the popular vote a single time. They now control the presidency. They control the Senate. Until recently, they controlled the House. They control a basically permanent majority on the Supreme Court. And just yesterday, they flipped the Third Circuit Court under Obama's tenure from Republican to Democrat. I do a lot of polling at Data Progress. If I had gone into the 115th Congress and asked people, what are your top priorities? What do you want to see this Congress do? I am very confident that massively cutting taxes from the wealthy and stripping health care from children was not what the general public wanted. But that's what they got. And, the Affordable Care Act had as part of its law Medicaid expansion. That expansion was struck down from the bench by John Roberts. Since then, that Medicaid expansion has been put on the ballot across the country a dozen times. Every time it's passed, except for one time in Montana when they tied it to an increase in the cigarette tax. In states like Tennessee, Medicaid expansion polls incredibly well. In every instance, it has been stymied by an increasingly radical Republican Party. And I think that what Howard Schultz and what many elites in this country will acknowledge is that fundamentally the Republican Party is the problem with American politics. This is a party. Yes, thank you. That is why I think young people have this like fire that everyone's like, why are you so mad? It's like, we've won the popular vote every time. We don't get anything. They're cutting taxes for rich people and taking away healthcare from kids instead of, solving the environmental crisis that we're facing. And we're watching these problems pile up and pile up and pile up and pile up. And then we face this problem where you look at all right, well, at least in 2020, we'll have a Democrat. And it's like, oh, wait, but then are we going to take the Senate? And then if we take the Senate, is Joe Manchin going to screw us over? So it's like, okay, and then we'll finally get one of the things that we want to do done. Maybe we'll get the Green New Deal or maybe get Medicare for all. And the Republicans will win again in that House and we'll have to wait 10 more years to do another one thing. And it's really, really frustrating to then hear well, okay, now, what we need to do is we need to come together. We need to bring Republicans and Democrats together. And it's just what is going to come of that? We have tried that sort of strategy. We have tried, the entire Obama first term, we tried to give something to Republicans to bring them to the table. And at every
Cap
time,
and trade
said,
rather
no,
than
exactly.
a carbon tax and got 0 votes. Obamacare rather than Medicare for all, and it got 0 Republican votes.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to say, I'm mad. I don't really have a point beyond that.
That's a big point. You made a big point. See, you got audience applause. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to continue with this panel. We'll start taking your calls and audience questions here in the Greene Space. And kind of as a follow-up to what Sean McElwee from Data for Progress was just saying, Walid, I'm going to ask when we come back about your article in The Nation in October, which suggested that a progressive caucus within the House of Representatives might be more important than who the presidential nominee is. So stay with us.
Hi, I'm Allison Stewart, host of All of It on WNYC. On the next All of It, Darina Allen, who is fondly referred to as the Julia Child of Ireland. She'll join us in studio to talk about classic Irish dishes and her new cookbook, Simply Delicious. Plus the actors who play Tevye and Golda in the critically acclaimed production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. Don't miss All of It, weekdays at noon on WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from the Performing Arts Center Purchase College. Alt classical group Portland Cello Project and vocalist Patty King pay homage to Radiohead in a program that includes the entire OK Computer album, Saturday, March 23rd at 8 p.m., tickets at artscenter.org. Rutgers University Continuing Studies, your lifelong learning partner, offering hundreds of courses for professional development and career advancement. More information at lifelonglearning.rutgers.edu. WNYC's digital transformation is supported by the Jerome L. Greene Foundation.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Lehrer on WNYC with you live from the Greene Space today. And by the way, when we are live in the Greene Space, you can watch The Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen, because we stream live on our website at WNYC.org and on the WNYC Facebook page. So check us out and see all these people who are on stage and me. And I don't know if we have cutaways of the audience. I'm not sure if the cameras work that way, but you can see the Greene Space at WNYC.org or the WNYC Facebook page with our guests, Sean McElwee, co-founder of the group Data for Progress, which calls itself a think tank for the future of progressivism, Sarah Leonard, executive editor of the criminal justice-oriented news site The Appeal, and Walid Shahid, communications director for Justice Democrats, a group working within the Democratic Party, described on their Twitter feed as, "We helped elect AOC because it's time for a Democratic Party that represents its voters, not just corporate donors." And let's go right to a phone call Here is Joyce in Oceanside. Joyce, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can hear you fine.
Okay, good. So you're talking about radical change, and obviously AOC supplanted Joseph Crowley. I'd like to talk as a victim of the machine that Joseph Crowley set up in the Queen's judiciary. Okay? I know Ross Barkin.
You told our screener you wanted to talk about the college cheating scandal. Are you going to talk about that?
Yes, as well. And that as a symptom.
Then make your Crowley point really concisely, okay?
Okay. As a symptom, the college cheating scandal is a symptom of a much broader problem that you've been addressing a bit, which is that money buys everything. Okay? I am a victim of another system in which money buys everything. The family courts in Queens and elsewhere, but I can speak to Queens, where judges are appointed by the Democratic machine. There is no independent oversight. There is zero accountability. And my ex-husband spent over $1 million in legal fees to plead poverty in court. My children and I were railroaded by the system. Okay, and I'd like to ask when the sunlight that has been shining in the recent day or so, and apparently in the investigation longer than that, on the scandal that was announced yesterday, I'd like to know when accountability will be, when we will see some accountability, some transparency in the court, in the family court system, in the foreclosure court system, the systems that are run by the Democratic machine in Queens.
Joyce, thank you very much for your call. We really appreciate it. Who wants to address any part of that? Sarah?
Sarah.
Yeah. So I obviously can't speak directly to this case or courtroom, but the problems that she's speaking to are very, very real. For one, there's no transparency in the judiciary at all. It's barely covered by the press as well. Something the appeal has been looking into expanding our coverage of is actually the judiciary. Because you've probably all had this experience. You go and vote, and you have to check off a bunch of judges. You cannot find information on who they are, why you would vote for one or the other, why they're there. I mean, it's so undemocratic and dysfunctional. And fines and fees in the court system are also a massive problem. There are municipalities across the United States. I mean, this was famously the case in Ferguson, where police departments are actually funded by collecting fines and fees from people, which of course incentivizes the police to come up with ways to collect those fines and fees, whether that's pulling people over, whether that's charging people in court, whether or not they've been found guilty of anything. And what this does is increase poverty, obviously, create fear and unfairness in the justice system, and it's just incredibly destructive to communities. And then I would say further that the coalitions that we've seen get built around the country to replace prosecutors who were incredibly punitive. We've seen this from Chicago to Texas. I mean, this is a national trend. These are exactly the coalitions we would want to see in building a new progressive left. These are coalitions of labor unions, people of color, poor people's advocates, all sorts of left-wing organizations, because these unfair and punitive justice systems tear communities apart on every level, whether it's increasing poverty through fines and fees or putting people in prison for long lengths of time. Those coalitions that have come together around prosecutor elections are, I think, going to start coming together more and more around judicial elections. And in fact, there was a DSA judge elected in Texas who has been talking a lot about the choices that judges make and how we can make better, more progressive choices in the courtroom, how the supposedly neutral position is actually highly political, and we can do it a lot better. So those are all essential points that she's talking about.
Thank you very much. Let's go to a question here in the Greene Space. Hello there.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm from Manhattan. I want to return to the 50,000-foot level about democratic socialism and say, I think that there has been obviously some pushback against the concept. I heard Rahm Emanuel talking about how it's a gift to the Republicans to put all this, really left-wing stuff out there, and it's difficult. As a Cold War baby myself. I mean, I remember the Bay of Pigs. I wonder if we're all a little bit under a hangover of the Cold War, and that when we hear the word socialism, we freak out. So why is it that you guys have not given some vision of the real-life examples, a vision of what countries have succeeded with this model, and can you give some of those examples so that people can gravitate towards something instead of simply away from something and get away from the fear in our society?
Thank you. So what's a country that would be the closest model to what you might be aiming for? Anyone? Sarah, go ahead.
I take up all the space. So we often point to the Nordic countries as sort of an interim model, right? And I know that in some ways that's unsatisfying to people because obviously the Nordic countries are not some sort of post-capitalist utopia and are themselves capitalist societies, but with serious social safety nets and large restrictions on capital. So, this is currently closer to what we're aiming for. That's I can't give you a perfect model of the perfect society. I don't think liberals could either. I think in many ways, socialists are the only people asked to describe a perfect utopia with no bumps in the road along the way because we're proposing something new. And, fair enough. So I think one way to think about it is something those countries are doing correctly that we want to do more is take things off the market that don't belong there. I might say decommodify things, but another way to say it would simply be that something like healthcare, something like saving us all from dying in a global warming apocalypse, those should not be left up to the vagaries of the market. And so we actually have a lot of models for how that can be done. And that's what we're looking at right now. Those are all the practical policies we're talking about.
And I think we're going to continue sort of at the 50,000 feet level with our next caller, Peter in the Bronx on line 7. Peter, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Yes. The word socialism used to have a particular meaning as an economic system which had to do with collective ownership of the means of production and distribution. It has become such an elastic, plastic concept. For the Republicans, it's Medicare is socialism. For Bernie, although the last comment may change this, the Scandinavian countries were socialists, even though they call themselves social democratic, and even though they have lower corporate taxes and better, Forbes said it's a better place to do business than the United States. I have no idea I don't know why you guys don't call yourself social democrats, because that seems to be what you are, although the last comment seems to point to some utopian notions, which I worry very much about because it's basically a concentration of power in the government.
Peter, I'm going to leave it there and get a response. Waleed and Sean, you know who else made the same comment to me off the air? I don't think he said it off the record, so I think I can say this. We had Rutger Bregman on the show yesterday, the guy who famously, spoke back to the people at Davos and spoke back to Tucker Carlson in that Fox News interview and wrote the book. I'm trying to remember the name of the book, Utopia for Realists. So just giving Rutger Bregman his due, Dutch, and I guess he'd call himself social democrat, because he said to me off the air, why do the American progressives insist on calling themselves democratic socialists when it's such difficult branding here? Why don't they just call themselves social democrats? Waleed, since you came with your DSA card.
Well, I think that's what people are calling it. And so even in Europe, the countries that are social democracies, the parties that enact those policies are often called the Socialist Party of Sweden, the Socialist Party of France, the Socialist Party of Spain. Like these are the names of the parties even in those countries. So that's when I started off, I was saying sometimes these terms are a little, not just loose in the US, but loose in Europe. The other thing I'd like to say is that even at South by Southwest, there was a German woman who asked AOC this question on why don't the Democrats just defend democratic socialism and social democracy as what Scandinavia already has? Why does Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and Cory Booker stand up and applaud at the State of the Union when Trump says America will never be a socialist country. Why do they give in to that? And AOC's response was, because Democrats don't believe in social democracy. There are lots of Democrats who don't support these kinds of things like Medicare for all or free college. Increasingly, the center of energy is moving and Democrats are coming around to it. But again, I think that there's this play happening where some of these terms are loose, and at the end of the day, like a lot of the programs that the United States did in the 1930s, 1940s, the GI Bill, you could call those social democratic socialist programs. And those are the very same programs that are under attack today. At the end of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King would say often that basically this country did have a social democracy for white male workers for a lot of this country. And what this country has never had is a multiracial social democracy where everyone has a right to free college.
And that kind of brings me to the articles that Waleed, you and Sean, you wrote in the last few months with, I think, overlapping themes. Sean, yours in These Times suggests that progressives in 2020 focus on primarying centrist Democrats in blue districts more than trying to flip purple districts. Can you explain?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I missed my chance to talk about Rahm Emanuel, and I was sad.
Go ahead. You can
no, I shouldn't, for the sake of your FCC license. Suffice to say, if anyone knows how to help Republicans, it's certainly Rahm Emanuel. But what I think that what we're really interested in doing is, what has changed the most the Democratic Party in the last few months has been, I think, the most exciting is, leaders of the next generation of the Democratic Party, almost all women of color leaders, leaders like Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Ocasio-Cortez, Deb Haaland, Johanna Hayes have fundamentally changed the Democratic Party. And all of these women were elected in safe Democratic districts, replacing, in some cases quite liberal, in other cases more moderate Democrats. And that has fundamentally changed the way that we talk about politics in America. A lot of these conversations about race and gender that have sort of been discussed in happy hours and in academic articles and in forums are now being front and center in the Democratic Party. And we still have a lot of sort of Democrats who are sort of go along to get along in D plus 15 to 30 districts. They have zero chance of ever losing a general election to a Republican. And yet, why are they not leading on important issues that matter to the base? And I think that there's an increasing age divide, and it sort of comes from this fact that guys like Joe Biden sort of remember this other Republican Party. They sort of are still afraid of ideas like abolishing ICE. They're still afraid of ideas like Green New Deal. And what we're saying is that in these safe Democratic districts, we can have real progressive leaders, and we can have people who approach issues differently. I think that Presley and Capuano is the perfect example. No one doubts that Capuano was a very good vote, a very liberal person.
Liberal Democrat from Massachusetts who got primaried and defeated by Ayanna Pressley.
I assume everyone just knows, you're not getting your Cook political report, and and what we have now instead is Ayanna Pressley, and Ayanna Pressley just talks about progressive issues in a different way. When she talks about gun violence, she talks about it from the experience of both a community that's had a lot of gun violence and also someone whose father has spent time in prison, and she talks about that. When she talks about sexual assault, she does it as a survivor. And that means a lot, and that matters, and the Democratic Party should represent that.
We have and Waleed, your article in The Nation in October suggested a progressive caucus within the House of Representatives, like Sean was just talking about, it might be more important than who the presidential nominee is. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I hope there's a Democrat in the White House in 2021, but at the same time, that Democrat is only going to be as progressive as the Democrats in the House and Senate push them to be. So, I worked on the Cynthia Nixon campaign. After the campaign ended, I basically read a bunch of Eric Foner books about the radical Republicans because that is what I do on vacation. And a lot of his work is about how this radical Republican caucus, radical meaning abolitionist at that time, not what it is currently, really pushed Lincoln tooth and nail to really come around to the crazy idea that maybe we should abolish slavery now, not in 10 years, not in 20 years. And so Thaddeus Stevens is the most well-known abolitionist Republican, famously depicted in the Lincoln movie. And he's introducing bills constantly to abolish slavery as soon as possible, and they never pass. It's kind of like how Bernie Sanders has spent his entire career in Congress. Ultimately, the Republican Party catches up to him because that radical caucus grows over time. And I just, if you had a larger, stronger progressive caucus like you do now in 2009, maybe we would have seen a public option happen. Maybe that caucus would have pushed President Obama to not negotiate from the beginning with Republicans, rather make the case and fight for a public option. And so the Progressive Caucus right now, led by Pramila Jayapal and Mark Pocan, is the strongest it's ever been in generations. And I really think that, electing, Democratic Socialists, progressives, a lot of us, I also want to backtrack, a lot of us were involved with Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the People's Climate March, the Dreamer Movement. The leaders of those movements, a lot of them are Democratic Socialists. And for all the marches, rallies, and sit-ins we did, the media would always tell us, you need to make political change from the inside. So now we're here, and they're telling us to get out, and the Democratic Party establishment is telling us to not be involved in party politics, not be involved in electoral politics. So this has been coming for a long time, and now, as Sean was saying, we have political expression for these ideas.
Let's take another question from here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi. So in an effort to come down from the 50,000-foot level and get at some of the financials and the economics of the vision that I hear you describing, you have a progressive caucus in the House and the Senate and an interested Democratic president. So you've achieved all that you want structurally in the political institutions. What could you articulate some vision of what wealth redistribution, taxation policy would look like for us in the future? Because I think that's where we get bogged down today in trying to articulate why the masses should embrace this type of approach as opposed to feeling immediately threatened by 40%, 50% income taxes like they have in the Scandinavian. So is there an elevator talk that you could, give us 90 seconds that we could bring to a cocktail party, assuming your political vision has been, not elected in 2020?
Everybody's thinking. Sean, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the nice things about the concentration of the wealth, in the hands of just 100 people, it means you only got to take it from 100 people. It's very easy now. The Koch brothers, they're just doing our job for us. They're getting all in one place, and we can just... no, I mean...
But then a lot of upper middle class people will say, and even lower, middle class people will say, oh, first they're going to come for the 100 and then they're going to come for me.
I mean, a starting point always is to say that we're spending massively right now. The government is spending like Marie Antoinette on billionaires, tax cuts, money to the military-industrial complex, et cetera. I mean, it's a very free-spending government at the moment, actually. The question is redirecting it in a productive way. We're currently spending it on things we don't want and we don't need, things that are actually increasing inequality. And when Trump went for his massive tax cut, nobody talked about that as spending, and of course that's spending. So I think, to Sean's point, actually, the starting point is understanding that we're doing a lot of spending in the wrong places. But I cut you off.
Oh, no, it's okay. No, I was going to say that the sort of, I look at study public opinion, and public opinion tends to be very thermostatic. So you have, sort of public opinion when there's not a lot of government spending, people want more of it, and then when there's more government spending, people want less of it. And what we're sort of seeing in public opinion today is that more and more people, so when I do polling, my cutoff for the highest income normally is 100,000. If you sample 1,200 people, that's the number of people who you can sort of make the top income bracket. But when the economists talk about inequality, they don't talk about 100,000 as the top 1%. They're talking about people who are in the millions, right? And so what I see is that there are a lot of people out there who make 100,000 a year who are far less worried about taxes than they are about affording childcare, affording a single medical bill could still bankrupt them. College debt could bankrupt them. And so you actually have more and more people who view themselves not as the sort of people who are going to be victimized by taxation, but instead people who would be the beneficiaries of better social services, better government spending.
We're just about out of time. I want to just give each of the three of you a chance in like 20 seconds. If that was an elevator pitch, think of this as a cubicle pitch. Just on your way out, just to shout out your organizations and what they do, because they're not all that well known. Sean, I'm going to stay with you. Data for Progress, what is it? Come on.
I call us a Posadist hive mind. No, I mean, we do a lot of research, polling. We do blueprints for policy, but we also try to actually make those real by engaging in politics.
Sarah, people should know about your relatively new news organization, The Appeal. What is it?
Yes, everyone should be reading The Appeal. And 87% of incarceration happens at the state and county level. The most powerful people in the system are prosecutors and people with power on that local level. Nobody reports on it. Local news has been decimated. Everyone wants to talk about the death penalty or private prisons, which are horrible real parts of the system, but very small parts of the system. And so what we've done is we are building an organization to report on where incarceration is actually happening and report on prosecutors who never get covered and actually giving daily coverage to this massive undercovered part of the justice system. So as you can tell, it's like a really bright read to start your morning with. But we also have 2 amazing podcasts, and so you can listen on the way to work.
Waleed?
JusticeDemocrats.com, you can find out more. We are the organization that helped recruit Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We helped elect Rashida Tlaib. We're fighting on big issues like the Green New Deal, rejecting corporate PAC money, Medicare for all, and basically trying to primary the old guard of the Democratic Party that does not agree with anything we've said.
Greene Space audience, please thank Waleed Shahid, Sarah Leonard, and Sean McElroy. And when we continue in a minute, we'll have the brand newly elected New York City public advocate here in the Greene Space, Jumaane Williams. Stay with us.
I'm Jacqueline Sincata, WNYC's program director. We are grateful for the outpouring of support received during our recent on-air fundraiser. Thank you so much. Your generosity inspires us. Did you know your employer may match your donation, which could double or triple your contribution? You can find out more at wnyc.org/match. Again, thank you very much for your support and for listening to WNYC.
WNYC is supported by the Stewart House at Silver Hill, offered by Silver Hill Hospital in collaboration with Yale New Haven Health and Yale Medicine for personalized mental health and substance use treatment for executives and professionals. TheStewartHouse.org. The Museum of the City of New York, presenting In the Dugout with Jackie Robinson, an exhibition of rare photos of the baseball legend on view through September 15th. More at mcny.org. Virgin Atlantic, providing over 300 hours of onboard entertainment, fully flat beds, and afternoon tea. Virgin Atlantic offers daily nonstop flights to the UK in partnership with Delta Airlines. You value the programs you hear on WNYC. That's why you're listening right now. So are thousands of others, people who would learn about your business on our air. Learn more about corporate sponsorship at wnyc.org/sponsor.
On WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And remember, listeners, when we're live in the Greene Space, if you want to watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it, you can. We stream live video from the Greene Space on the WNYC Facebook page, also at WNYC.org. Now, audience, give yourself a round of applause if you voted at all in the New York City public advocate election last month. Applaud if you did not vote in that election, but you live in New York City. Wow. So considering that like 5% of the people voted in that election, okay, it wasn't that little. We have a very politically engaged audience, very unrepresentative here in the Greene Space today. If it's your, well, hardly anybody gave themselves a round of applause for not voting, but that would have been a first. How many of you think that voting should be mandatory in the United States? How many think it shouldn't be mandatory? That's interesting. Anybody, we have the microphones ready? Anybody want to say why you think it should not be mandatory in the United States? Because I think mandatory is slightly won among you obsessive voters, right? You're the people who vote in like every judicial special election. On this side, hi.
Hello, Jonathan Rivera, Bronx Lehman College. I think the reason it should not be mandatory is making voting mandatory would be an infringement on just constitutional rights, and there's a freedom within your right to vote or not to vote. So impending on that would just be a flagrant violation of just constitutional rights and freedom as a whole.
Okay, and we don't need to have a whole big debate on this, but just curious. I was just curious. I didn't expect so many of you to have voted in the special election for New York City Public Advocate, and they didn't expect you to have such divided views on mandatory voting. So that's really interesting. And by the way, we have a group from Lehman College here today. Right? Those of you who are from Lehman College, give yourselves a round of applause. Okay, so a little group from Lehman College. Thank you for coming out. And with us now, the newly elected New York City Public Advocate, Jumaane Williams, who dominated last month's special election with 33% of the vote in a 17-candidate field. No one else came close to the city councilman from Brooklyn, who, remember, had also run last year in the primary for lieutenant governor against Andrew Cuomo's running mate, Kathy Hochul. Mr. Public Advocate, congratulations, and thanks for making this one of your early stops.
Thanks for having me. I thank you for not asking how many people voted for me by clapping. I didn't want to get embarrassed on live TV.
We have a secret ballot in this country.
But I appreciate it. Everyone who came out and voted, period. Everyone who came out and supported me. This is exciting. I'm still kind of coming to grips with it now, because it's one thing to run and it's another thing to actually win, and it's like a bit of a shock. But so far so good. We're working through the transition. Very excited
because we're in front of a live audience who can see you and a viewing audience streaming this online. I know you talk openly about your Tourette's syndrome, which makes you shake sometimes. What should the public know about it?
I'm as cool as a fan up here. I'm all right. But you know, Tourette's is actually much more well known than when I was diagnosed in the 9th grade. I often had to answer more questions than I do now. I simply say I have Tourette's syndrome. People usually know what it means, but it's involuntary motor tics, which is body. I have mostly those, and vocal tics, which is sound. I had mostly those when I was younger.
So you say it to live audiences basically to put people at ease.
Yeah, I'm good. I get off with a lot of water though. That's what I do.
Which is a good practice in general.
It's healthy in general. Yeah.
Why do you think you won?
Because people voted for me.
Thank you for coming today.
I mean, I gotta say, I was very worried until 9/01 election day. We were really on the ground hustling as hard as we could. I was surprised at the percentage point. I was thankfully pleasantly surprised from my side, but I was really surprised to see that. And I was just happy because, you know, from when I first got elected, I was told I was told I was too much of an activist, and I had to choose. And I said, no, I don't. The best elected officials are activists. And I was always told I had to change my message, even when I ran for lieutenant governor. And I said, no, this message is, I believe, what people need in government. And it turns out that people were receptive for it. The first time I ran for LG, as well as the second time I ran for public advocate. So I'm just excited about that. This dynamic where we are in politics, I think it's going to help bring us out of the orange darkness that we're in now.
The orange darkness. Your victory speech on election night was unforgettable. Honestly, one of the most beautiful and genuine things I've ever seen in politics, including your tears and talking openly about being in therapy the last 3 years and reaching out in that speech to kids who might be crying themselves to sleep sometimes, like you sometimes did. Since most of our listeners did not see that speech, can you describe what in your life inspired it and what kind of kid out there today you were envisioning?
Wow. All right. I'm trying not to break down this time. I've been most touched by folks. I don't know if I really expected, but a lot of folks have reached out who have said it inspired them to talk about the therapy they're going through. And that was really very much a key part for me, because in certain communities, I think therapy and mental health is just something that's too taboo. And I think those communities sometimes need it the most. And so people will talk about going to the dentist, sometimes they got to go to the doctor, but they very reluctantly, in particular communities, won't talk about going to see a therapist, going to need mental health. And we very often make mental illness synonymous with mental health, and they're not. I think people definitely need attention when they have mental illness, but I think everybody in this room needs to address the mental health issues. And I wanted to make it a commonplace discussion. And I know as a kid, the things I was going through, and I often try to figure out what could I say to myself that I would have listened to, because it's hard to talk to young people. And so whenever I'm talking, that's what's in my mind. And I just wanted folks to know that whatever you're going through, other people are probably going through it as well, and they need to talk about it. And having these discussions just in general are helpful. Having it with a professional is even better. And it's okay to want to live your best life, and it's okay to talk about it, and that was important.
And when you said in that stretch, introducing that stretch, I want to say that to black men who are listening. Do you think there are ideas that men in general have about masculinity that need to be challenged? Was that part of what you were getting at there?
Absolutely. We're in a time where toxic masculinity is being exposed for what it is. We're at a time where we have a unique opportunity to change that dynamic, and some of it is talking about what masculinity is and what it isn't, and making sure that people understand asking for help, having these feelings, or it's a strength to reach out for help. It's not a weakness, and everybody's going through this. And I think certain communities, when you hold it in, it expresses itself anyway, and it's detrimental to the entire community. And so we need to begin to talk about these things more. And black men have been included in some of the folks who've reached out, and people have talked about their husbands now being happy to talk about it. That to me has been the most touching. And when I was thinking about saying it, that's what I was hoping would spark. I didn't realize how impactful it would be when I actually was saying it, but I'm just honored that people are now speaking.
Had you planned that part, or did you ad-lib that part?
I had thought about both. I had thought about saying something like this at an important time. I didn't know exactly when. I had been talking about, maybe in the last year or so, more openly about it. I guess people listen more when you get elected. But I had been very open about it. But it was important that there was an opportunity to do it, and I was debating whether I should or not. I actually had a lot more I wanted to say, but I realized I was breaking down pretty rapidly, so I just tried to get out what I could.
You also said in that stretch, there was a time when the title I held was my identity, and that's a dangerous thing. The best time came for me when I realized no matter what title I have, there is a space in the world for me, and I can make incredible change, unquote. That's a male thing too, right? Being so identified with your job as a guy who is.
I'm trying to hold it together right now.
If I'm pushing it too.
It's all right. I actually haven't watched the speech. I can't. So I haven't seen it.
But that was interesting about identifying with your title, meaning your work, right?
Yeah, and it was true even before I was elected, even when I was an executive director of an organization, as a community organizer, my work, I was so focused on that. And I think that's because that was easier, because I understood that, than dealing with outside of work. And so everything kind of got melded together in an unhealthy way. And once I realized a pathway to see myself in the world without whatever title, it was really freeing. And it was freeing in terms of even decisions I have to make in a political level. Running for lieutenant governor would be great to win. If I didn't, I'd be okay. The decision to run for a public advocate is pretty cool to win, I gotta say that. But I'd be okay if it wasn't. And I remember I went to Grenada with Dr. Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X. And I remember her saying, and this is my 20s, what her husband used to tell her was take a picture of the world and see if you can see yourself in it. And that always stuck with me, trying to figure out how to actually accomplish that. And once I had a clearer understanding of that. It was just amazing, and I don't know if I would have gotten there without the therapy.
This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. Brian Lehrer with you live from the Greene Space and with the newly elected New York City Public Advocate, Jumaane Williams. So now let's talk about your title and your job, public advocate.
All the things I just said at work now.
That's right. Just roll right over those. Disregard the previous 5 minutes. And what does that title mean to you? And a job with, honestly, limited powers, what do you hope to accomplish?
And I'm pretty excited. It's just the one place where people, I guess, talk about the limitation of the powers instead of how many powers it actually has. And so I'm excited about what the office does. And so for folks who don't know, that there are 5 kind of powers that are ingrained in it. And one is you can introduce legislation. The other is you can appoint people to boards. The other is you're just an ombudsman, a watchdog over city government, a go-between between the people and the government. You get a vote on the pension board, and you get to appoint people to important commissions and committees like the City Planning Commission. But on top of that, the bully pulpit is amazingly powerful. And so much so, when I ran for lieutenant governor, I actually said that I wanted that position to be the public advocate of the state. And I really see the value of having someone whose sole job is keeping basically government honest. The other position is, I would like to spend a lot of time on, is just the charter cop. The public advocate is a person that makes sure that agencies are doing their charter mandated duties on behalf of the people of the city. And some of this work I've tried to do as a council member to the best of my ability. And so I'm inspired now that people entrusted me with this position now, and I'm looking forward to it.
And Greene Space audience, we could take a few questions for Jumaane Williams from here. If anybody wants to raise your hand, we'll come around with microphones. Maybe 1 or 2 on the phones as well. 212-433 WNYC 433-9692. I also want to get your take on who came in second in the race. The only Republican in the 17-person race, Queens City Councilman Eric Ulrich with 19% of the vote. Some people took that as a sign of backlash against so many Democrats in the race, helping to chase Amazon away. Did you read it that way?
Not at all. One, Amazon should have been handled, and that discussion should have been handled differently from the beginning. And the 3 people responsible for that are the mayor, the governor, and Jeff Bezos. They are the ones responsible for the horrendous way that this was discussed. I'm happy that people's voices were heard, but I lament the fact that we weren't able to have a complete discussion because of how it was introduced. And so that's important. What I think it was, many people would talk about, just from another publication, City and State magazine had a list of quote unquote de Blasio's enemies and quote unquote de Blasio's friends. And there were 2 people on the enemies list. That was me and Eric Ulrich. So I don't think it's...
When was that?
That was maybe a week or 2 before the election.
Oh, that recently.
Yeah. And so it was interesting. I think people are frustrated with the way government is working. And I always say many of the issues that we have came before Trump. And so people have to remember that. And they came with oftentimes Democrats in charge. And I'm saying that as a Democrat. You have across this country Democratic governors and mayors and city council leaders that have failed us in a very similar way. And we have to be able to hold them accountable as well. There are points that I agree with this mayor. I want to make sure we work together. Obviously, for folks who know me, there are points where we don't agree at all. And my job now is to make sure that that's discussed and we get some results from it. And I believe that many people in the city, based on the top 2, had a similar vision of who should be in that office.
What is your biggest critique of Mayor de Blasio?
I often said that the mayor I endorsed in 2013 is not the mayor I saw in 2018. My hope is in 2019 we'll see things different. I'm not sure because he's spending a lot of time outside of the city recently. And so my hope is that he'll refocus here a little bit. I don't want to disparage anyone's ambitions, far be it, because I had my own. And you don't want to disparage that. But there are concerns here, whether it is accountability, transparency in government, from Amazon to policing, where we've just come a long way than the last administration. It was a low bar, but I do want to give credit to where we are now, except for transparency and accountability. And things like housing in particular. We've just failed miserably. And we failed because of things that were put forth by this administration. And unfortunately, at the time, a council that didn't have the political will to push back.
Let's take a question for you from here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi, congratulations, Mr. Williams, on
Thank
the
you.
victory. I wanted to talk about housing. I've had the bad luck of living in multiple apartments where the management company has either hidden the fact that the unit was rent stabilized or claimed that the stabilization had lapsed during my tenancy. And my only option was to take them to housing court, where the costs of fighting the landlord in housing court would have been greater than just moving out of the unit and trying to find a new place to live. So what is the feasibility of something that would allow me to engage with the landlord without having to involve a lawyer? Or is there a way that landlords can be licensed like food service workers or massage therapists or so many other people, and if they keep violating the laws that are already in place, that they can have their license revoked and no longer to be allowed to be renting to tenants until they fix these issues?
I'm sorry you had those experiences. You always will mention I started my career primarily as a community organizer, tenant organizer in particular. And I always say that it was before Barack Obama was elected, so no one knew what it was. And my mother wanted me to get a real job. I tried to convince her that it was a real job. It's interesting that those two things you mentioned, I actually have bills about. And so one bill is being heard, is it next week? They'll have a bill being heard next week in the Housing Committee to list prominently whether a building is rent stabilized or not, so that people can understand that when they go in the building, that's rent stabilized, and find out what it means, because landlords do try to hide that, and it is important. And it's important not just so folks understand. People often talk about the price point, but that's not the only important thing. The point is the protections that come with it, like automatic lease renewals that people may not think about until you have to get a repair, and you have to decide whether you want to fight for that repair and not get your lease renewed, and that's critically important. And I have a bill that I've been pushing for a while, which is actually licensing people who are landlords. And so we're hoping to see if we can get a hearing on that soon, because I do think they need to be licensed, and they should be revoked if there's a continuing pattern of abusive behavior. Rent regulation in general was up in June of this year, and we have to do a lot to make sure that is strengthened. I'm pushing for universal rent control, not just in New York City, by the way, across the state. There is a huge problem here, and it's the number one thing that we can do right now to preserve the affordability and the protections that we have.
There is a universal rent control, and that's one like our Democratic Socialist panel was talking about earlier in the show, that when people first hear it, it makes their head spin. And then when, like, it's pie in the sky utopian, and then when they hear some of the details, maybe not. We had State Senator Jessica Ramos on last week, who I see has got a bill that would limit rent increases. Let's see if I get this right. Limit rent increases to just a little bit over the rate of inflation for people of certain means. Is that a good way to do it?
There's a lot of ways to do it. That's an excellent way to do it, and I'm happy to support that. We can't do nothing. Like, I know nothing is a big problem. We have people now that are. People may not preferential rent, and I would recommend that anyone who's a tenant now go back and look at their lease, because many people are on preferential rents that have no understanding of what that is until their rate goes up. And so there are communities who are being ravaged right now. Even though Rent Guidelines Board will give a rent increase of, say, 1% or 2% or no percent, if you have preferential rent and you came in lower than the market, that landlord can raise the rent as much as he wants to the market rate. So people are getting increases of $500, $1,000, and they're losing their homes. And so these are some of the things that we have to strengthen in the rent law.
One more here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi, Mr. Williams. Congratulations. I'm so excited that you won.
Thank you.
So I'm a community board member in Brooklyn, and I'm curious, I'm not sure if the community boards are something that the public advocate interacts with much, but since you come from more of a community organizing background, I'm wondering if you have any ideas or plans for sort of treating community boards as more of a activist group and more of an opportunity to really make change that comes from a grassroots spirit.
So I think the short answer is yes. I started out as a community board member, actually, on Community Board 18. There are different, like I represented about 3 or 4 community boards, and the way they interacted was different. You had some that was very top down. You had some that was very much from the community up. So it's often different who the community board is and their culture. But the short answer is yes, the community board has to be very much more involved. One of the things that we said that we want to do in the campaign was have a deputy public advocate in every borough, and we intend to accomplish that. And that's from the community organizing background and thought process that I have. That very often the administration, most administrations, but in definitely this one, they tend to do things to people. And we need to have a conversation to do things with folks. And so I'm hoping the public advocate's office can be where folks' voice are heard to be able to push back on whatever's occurring in that community. And the community board is a very, very important piece of that. I did just want to go back to housing really briefly, because I did want to mention something called MIH, which is Mandatory Inclusionary Housing. And people may not have heard of that, but they have heard of the rezonings that have occurred in this city that have not provided enough affordability. And we are asking for a moratorium on most rezonings until we reopen this baseline, which was called MIH, which has been a failure since we voted in last term, and we know it's a failure now. I'm hoping to reopen that. And then I wanted to shout out CUF, Churches United for Fair Housing, because I've supported their pledge to try to get a racial impact study done before any rezoning is accomplished in the city. And I think it's important that we move forward on those.
We just have a minute left, but let's follow up on that. Mandatory inclusionary housing. When that was proposed and de Blasio was running on it in 2013, that was considered the progressive position as opposed to voluntary inclusionary housing, so that if a landlord or a developer was going to get a zoning variance so that they could build higher, the progressive thing de Blasio was running on and implemented was that under those circumstances, they would be required to put in, I think it's at least 20 or 25% affordable units. So why is that not enough?
Well, it's all about in presentation. And so if you're asking if this is better than it was, then yes. But the question is not always, is it better? The question is, what did you have the power to do and not do? And we fail when you ask the question in that way. And so they often said that this is the best inclusionary housing in the country, which I think is an indictment of how bad the issue is. It's not how good MIH is. And so one of the things that was problematic is with the options, there are some options that have no deep affordability at all. So within the 3 options, many people choose the last 2. It gets a little more policy wonkish, but basically they choose the last 2 that has no deep affordability at all.
The developers have choices,
yes.
And it can be less affordable if they have more units like that or something like that.
Basically. So when you choose the last 2, you have no deep affordability. So folks like me were saying just simply make a deep affordability in every option. I actually don't support 100% deep to low income. I like a mix. I think you have to have a mix. But the problem is when there's only one set of folks that choose that deep affordability, we're continuing the segregation of the city, and we're not getting, we're not changing up segregation, and we're not getting the deep affordability that we need. People who are a teacher and a firefighter, they need assistance too. But if they need assistance, I know people who are making $30,000 need help, and we failed then, and we need to change it now.
Thank you so much for coming in. Jumaane Williams, the New York City public advocate-elect. When do you actually get sworn in?
Oh, that's more than a minute question. So I actually have taken oath of office, but it will be official on Tuesday.
That's great. Well, keep coming back and talking to us as we both try to serve the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Much more to come live in the Greene Space here, including right now the latest news live from the Greene Space stage with Richard Hake.
Thanks, Brian. A second sentencing for former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort is underway in Washington. He pleaded guilty to charges related to illegal lobbying. Today, the 69-year-old is set to receive a sentence in federal court for 2 conspiracy counts that could total as many as 10 years. Last week, Manafort was sentenced in Virginia to nearly 4 years in prison on charges of bank and tax fraud. Meanwhile, here, New York Attorney General Letitia James has reached an agreement with the state legislature in case President Trump pardons his former associate. Karen DeWitt has that.
The measure is aimed at holding associates of President Donald Trump accountable for crimes they may have committed within New York's boundaries, even if the president pardons them of federal crimes that they've been convicted of.
We do have an agreement with both houses. We anticipate that the bill will be passed in the coming weeks.
Under the concept of double jeopardy, Americans cannot be charged and prosecuted twice for the same crimes. The measure now before the legislature would carve out an exception to the double jeopardy protections in the event of presidential pardons.
Mayor de Blasio is traveling to New Hampshire this weekend as he continues to contemplate a run for president. On Fox 5 this morning, de Blasio says he wants to share initiatives he's implemented in New York City.
I want to go and talk about the things that we are doing in this city that are making a huge difference in people's lives. So I've talked about earlier, pre-K for all, paid sick leave. We've announced we're guaranteeing health care for everyone who doesn't have insurance.
The mayor initially planned to visit New Hampshire last month, but postponed that trip due to the death of an NYPD detective. The city's plan to rebuild a portion of the Brooklyn-Queens expressways, meaning some resistance. It involves putting a temporary 6-lane highway right through the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. WNYC's Stephen Nesson reports there's another proposal.
It comes from the office of Comptroller Scott Stringer. His plan would make the BQE from Hamilton Avenue to the Brooklyn Bridge a 2-lane, trucks-only roadway. With all that extra space, he'd cover the roadway trench in Carroll Gardens and turn it into a 2-mile park.
Replacing one superhighway with another superhighway just continues a 50-year view of New York City that is just clogging our streets, not creating the space, open space that we need.
Cars, in Stringer's scenario, would be diverted to the Hugh Carey Tunnel, Belt Parkway, or will be abandoned for public transit. Now the plan needs a traffic study to see if it's even feasible.
In New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy and legislative leaders say they have a deal to legalize marijuana, but they may not have the votes needed. Some legislators are wary that the current bill doesn't do enough for people of color. WNYC's Karen Rouse reports on that.
There's this strange irony that people who were selling marijuana in the past now have records because they were arrested, and now it's legal to sell marijuana, and they can't sell marijuana because they sold marijuana in the past.
Many details about the bill have not been made public, such as who will be allowed to sell it and whether the state will expunge previous charges for marijuana possession. And a programming note, the governor will be on WNYC later tonight on Ask Governor Murphy. That airs at 7 o'clock, and you can also submit a question right now at askgovernormurphy.org. Mostly sunny skies expected today, highs near 51 degrees, cloudy tonight, lows around 38, and then tomorrow, gradual clearing. We should see some sun by the afternoon, a little warmer with high near 61 degrees with a chance of rain and showers and thunderstorms on Friday. That's the latest from the WNYC newsroom, live here in the Greene Space. I'm Richard Hake.
Governor Phil Murphy still thinks that raising taxes on millionaires is the best way to help the heavily taxed middle class in New Jersey.
Those at the very top are shouldering less and less of their fair share of the tax burden. That's the opposite of tax fairness.
I'm Nancy Solomon. Join me for our monthly live call-in special where you can speak directly with the governor about your concerns for New Jersey. Ask Governor Murphy, tonight at 7 on WNYC.
WNYC supporters include the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping public radio advance journalistic excellence in the digital age. Knight Foundation believes informed and engaged communities are essential for healthy democracy. More at knightfoundation.org. Join New York Public Radio's Community Advisory Board for a conversation with Clemency Burton Hill, Creative Director of Music, tonight at 6:30 in the Greene Space. Details at 646-829-4000 or wnyc.org/cab.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone, live from the Greene Space. And when we do the show in the Greene Space, about once a month, Next one's going to be on April 12th, I think, and you can get tickets even now at wnyc.org/The Greene Space. But when we do the show from here, you can watch as well as listen. We stream live video of the Greene Space stage on the WNYC Facebook page or on our website at wnyc.org. Our next guest was a Border Patrol agent from 2008 to 2012, and he's written a book called The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border, about his time on that force. Very relevant, obviously, with the President's National Emergency Declaration, his latest budget request just out for $8 billion in additional wall money next year, and the new data from the Border Patrol showing 76,000 migrants crossed from Mexico without authorization in February, the highest in 12 years. Is that enough to count as an emergency? Migrants traveling as families are also now the majority of those caught trying to cross, different from years past. Former Border Patrol agent Francisco Cantu joins us now. Welcome to WNYC and the Greene Space.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can we start with a little of your own family story? Was it your grandmother, do I have that right, who came from Mexico?
It was my grandfather on my mother's side, and he crossed the border as a small child during the Mexican Revolution. So they were. His family was fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution from Monterrey, Nuevo León, and so in that way at the time they were refugees fleeing violence. So they came in the same way that many people are coming now.
So with that in your own background, what made you want to join the Border Patrol of all career paths?
That is a good question. My idea in joining the Border Patrol, I guess for a little bit of context, I joined right after college, after doing my undergraduate degree. I grew up in Arizona, and sort of at a town that's like far enough away from the border that it wasn't an everyday reality, but close enough so that it wasn't abstract. And I studied immigration and border issues in college. In Washington, D.C., of all places. So I imagined when I was graduating as like a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, that if I just joined the Border Patrol, I would have all of these, I would see all of these answers that, had eluded everybody else because they had never put in the time along the border. And so it was kind of this naive idea of, accumulating a bag of tricks to fix the whole problem.
Idealism is good, though, right? You would agree?
It's a tricky thing. Yeah, it is good. Idealism is good, but naivete is often part of that, and that can be tricky.
So, how much is your story one of becoming disillusioned by seeing some of what the Border Patrol does?
I mean, I think that's a big part of it. I think, coming into the Border Patrol looking for answers with very specific questions. I think part of me joining was like a grand misestimation of like the power of an institution to sort of normalize what happens within the institution. And, Border Patrol training is much like military, any military or law enforcement training. It's sort of designed to, break down your idea of who you are as an individual, rebuild you as a member of this force. And so, my experience was that very quickly after going through the academy, showing up in the field, a lot of these questions were had been pushed out of my mind because I just needed to show up at work, not get yelled at, wake up the next day, do it all over again. And all of a sudden, years later, I'm kind of looking at what am I participating in, and am I getting these answers that I joined to find?
So, for example, can you lay out some of the unintended consequences of border crackdowns that you describe in the book?
Sure, and I think that something that we have to be grappling with right now is how unintended these consequences are, or at what point does an unintended consequence no longer become unintended. So I think like the case in point would be the policy of prevention through deterrence, which is a policy that was begun under the Clinton administration, in which a lot of crackdowns started happening in first, Tijuana, San Diego, El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, in which these cities were heavily policed by the Border Patrol. Agents were put along the line, within sight of one another, every mile or less. And, what that did was push crossings away from urban centers. It was on the nightly news every night. There's a lot of voters in these cities. And by pushing crossings away from the public eye, it pushed people through these remote, rugged desert areas that we think of now when we think of people crossing the border. But that's, that was a relatively new phenomenon. And the quote unquote unintended consequence of that was that that people are losing their lives in far greater numbers, and they continue to be losing their lives, and they've been losing their lives for decades. So the question is sort of at what point should that have been seen and corrected? Because it's been policy for more than 20 years.
And it was policy to, when you use the word deterrence, like the separation of families by the Trump administration to send a message back to the sending countries that this is not going to go well for you, don't come.
Exactly. The idea was that, first of all, it's so rugged and hostile and there's no water that people wouldn't dare risk it. And that was the same idea behind child separation, right? That it's going to be so miserable and people aren't going to risk being separated from their families. But what we've seen time and time again is that, no matter what version of hell you implement at the border, people are going to cross through that or endure it in order to get to the other side, especially if there are family members on the other side. There is the security of, safety from certain death or violence that you're fleeing in your home country. And I actually think that, child separation and a lot of the Trump policies have, in a sort of perverse way, caused and created the surge that is happening right now.
Listeners, excuse me, we can take a phone call or two for Francisco Cantu, former Border Patrol agent and now the author of the book, The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border. And here in the Greene Space, raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. And let's take a question right now here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hello, Jonathan Rivera, Bronx Lehman College again. The ACLU recently reported that it had seen an increase in the amount of abuses against detainees in the ICE Detention Center. I wanted just to get your view and just overlook on that.
Sure. I think like the foundational thing that should be understood about the way immigration, I can only speak specifically towards the Border Patrol. ICE is a different agency. But I think I could make, broad generalized statements about the way that immigration agents are trained. And of course, at the academy, you're being trained for criminal encounters. And everything that you are being, the rhetoric that's used to describe the people who are talking is one of criminality. The people that are crossing. And, the idea of like being safe and, protecting America, protecting your life, you're always looking at these people as a threat. And the reality is that most of the vast majority of the encounters that you have, or that I had at least in the Border Patrol, were humanitarian encounters. We're talking about some of the most vulnerable people in the Western Hemisphere. And so these are not violent encounters. These are not criminal encounters. And I think that's an inherent problem of law enforcement training in general.
And you write in the book, Border Patrol often touts its search and rescue operations as evidence of the agency's humanitarian priorities. What do they mean by search and rescue, and do you think they are not evidence of that?
Well, I think like the following sentence is, for the Border Patrol to present itself as making humanitarian rescues would sort of be like firefighters going out, putting out a blaze and expecting to be lauded when in fact that blaze was started by their own fire chief.
76,000 arrests in a month. Is that an emergency? Or Trump would ask, is that not an emergency?
Well, I think there's two important things to remember. Trump has been saying that this is a crisis and an emergency ever since he arrived in office. When he arrived in office, crossings were at historic 40-year low. And the other thing, so now like it seems that we are at a new, crossings have doubled in the last month or short period of time, but they've doubled from a historic low, right? So they're still they're still not near the numbers that they were in the mid 2000s. And I think the other thing that's important to realize is that when you start separating children from their families, the news travels very fast through these smuggling rings and communities, sending communities. And so when that policy was halted, a lot of people were like, oh no, if we better go now, because who knows what will happen next, and who knows when this policy will be re-implemented. And so in a lot of ways, people are scrambling to get across right now because they don't know what the next horrible thing is going to happen.
Are you afraid, though, that with answers like that the Trump administration may just go back to that policy? I mean, I think they are, to be honest, still separating families at the border, just maybe not in the same ways or to the same degree as they were before, but maybe they'll just go back to it now as a response to this surge.
Well, they would love to go back to it, and they would love to do anything that they could really get away with. And let's make no mistake about it, the only reason that policy was reversed to the extent that it was reversed, if we believe that, was because of the outrage of the public. And so I think, particularly in this political moment when there's so many things to be outraged about, part of our job around this issue is to sustain our outrage, to remain outraged at this, and to not let it go back into, the shadows of, because these terrible things have been happening along the border under Obama and under President Bush and under President Clinton, but it wasn't as much in the public eye.
But by this logic, presumably there would be even more people coming, unauthorized crossing, if they don't crack down at the border. No?
And so it's sort of this perverse cycle. And I think what you see is that like the rhetoric of crisis is one that feeds itself, right? And so the crisis, I think is a manufactured crisis, and it will continue to engineer itself.
Let's take another question here in the Greene Space. Hi there. Is this another Lehman College student?
Yes.
Great.
Rose Sterling, Lehman College. Yes, I would like to ask you, don't you think that it's better to ask President Trump to increase your skills, hard skill, military skill, in case the war is built? Because after building the wall, it will look like self-containing means. And Russia or China may come and set a military base in Mexico. So in a global war, I think that all of you shall object the war. And we have only a better social policy than building a war, because war humanitarian is cheaper than a Russian base, military base.
Social policy, when you say a better social policy, do you mean to help the countries from which so many immigrants are coming?
Coming to stay, having better lives, because all of them are coming not because they really want to be here, but you have some, they still admiring America, but because they're hungry, we have to understand that and use our powerful country means and be more human than rejecting people, because it's a shame today that we live like we live today and see people around us dying when we can do something without losing.
A profound question.
Well, I think that after World War II, the Marshall Plan was sort of the response to help Germany and Europe rebuild itself, and I think. I used to have an answer that, I think that all of the money that we're spending on border enforcement and border militarization would be, much better used in, foreign development, foreign aid. But I was having a conversation with a Mexican writer, and she told me, we don't want your money. We don't, because that money comes with strings attached, and that it's a sort of like an old questions around imperialism. I think what I think about as a writer is most foundationally the language that we use to talk about immigration and the border as a place and as a cultural landscape. And I think that the rhetoric that so many of us use in our day-to-day lives, and that we see and hear all the time from the media, is really a profoundly dehumanizing rhetoric. And I think that as long as that rhetoric underlies how we talk about these things, I kind of think that that's the first step, is to change how we talk about and the language that we use to talk about it.
You write in the book a little bit about your friend Jose, whose family you try to help as Jose is detained and fighting deportation. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about Jose and his situation?
Sure. Jose was someone that I met, several years after I had left the Border Patrol. I went to school to get an MFA to write this book. I was working at a coffee shop as a barista. So, my life really couldn't have been any different.
There aren't a lot of career paths out there that are Border Patrol to MFA.
No, it's an uncommon career path. And, I couldn't have been in, any further from the work that I was doing, so I thought. And, I struck up a friendship with the guy who was the maintenance man at the cafe where I worked, and he would come drink his coffee every day at the counter and eat his breakfast burrito. And he was from Oaxaca, and we had a lot of conversations. We became, friends over the course of like 2 years. And then all of a sudden, he didn't show up for work, and he had literally never missed a day of work. And it turned out that his mother had died, and he went back to Oaxaca to be at her side as she was passing. And then he could not get back across the border. And this is a person who had lived in the United States for over 30 years, had 3 U.S. citizen children, and all of the sudden, someone that I knew and really cared for was thrust into the deportation industrial complex, right, when he tried to cross and was apprehended. And so it was sort of the first time for me that I was looking behind this curtain at what would happen to all of the people that I would have arrested in the field and sent to be deported.
And in fact, you close the book with words from his story. What are you trying to say by closing with some of Jose's own words?
Well, I think what's really important in this political moment specifically is to listen to the voices of those who are being most affected by the issues that we're debating and by the policies that we're debating. And I really think that someone like Jose has much more to tell us about the cost of border enforcement than I do. And I think that only by listening to the people in our lives and in our communities that are being affected by this can we understand how profound an issue it really is. I mean, I've spoken with people who literally fear that a helicopter might land in their yard in the middle of the night and take their children away. And I think that kind of fear is the kind of fear that we imagine people living with in, far away countries under military dictatorship. But, people right here in our backyard live with that fear every day.
So final question. What would it change in your opinion, and what wouldn't it change if Trump got his way and there was a wall all across the U.S.-Mexican border? Would it end all this ambiguity, and then the country could just decide who it wants to take and who it doesn't?
Well, if you calculate the landmass of the United States border, so, there, I think, like, if you include Alaska and the Hawaiian Islands and, the coastline and the Canadian border, the U.S.-Mexico border is like 2% of our actual, like, land border. So we would be talking about, Coast Guard, like increasing our Coast Guard, increasing like international travel, security, all of these things, people would still find a way to get in, and we would just be talking about militarization in another context.
Francisco Cantu, his book is called The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border, about his time as a Border Patrol agent from 2008 to 2012 before he went for his MFA. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More to come from the Greene Space right after this.
An FBI investigation takes doing cutthroat college admissions to a whole new level.
All of them knowingly conspired to help their children either cheat on the SAT or ACT and or buy their children's admission to elite schools through fraud.
But the 1% shelling out big bucks to get their kids into college isn't anything new. I'm Tanzina Vega, and that's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from John Theurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. Learn how John Theurer Cancer Center is pioneering the possible at jtcancercenter.org. The Joyce Theater, presenting Hubbard Street Dance Chicago. 3 works from choreographer Crystal Pite running through this Sunday. Tickets at joyce.org. WNYC is a media partner of Brooklyn Public Library, presenting Lit Film, a festival of films about writers, March 18th to 24th. Maya Angelou, Margaret Atwood, Pablo Neruda, and more. bklynlibrary.org/BPL presents.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
WNYC, live in the Greene Space today, and when we are in the Greene Space, you can watch the show as well as listen. Go to the WNYC Facebook page for live streaming video or to WNYC.org. And with us now in the Greene Space is a top lawyer for the New York Times, David McCraw. He is their Deputy General Counsel, and he has a new book called Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. And of course, it's the age when we have a president who campaigned like this.
I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money.
Donald Trump in 2016 there, and maybe you saw David McCraw's op-ed in the Sunday Review section called Think Like a Libel Lawyer. David, thanks for joining us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you for having me, Brian, and great job reading the title. It's a mouthful.
What's the basic idea of libel law?
The basic idea of libel law, as it was originated, was that if somebody says something untrue that harms somebody's reputation, that person can sue for damages.
Does the falsehood need to be not just false, but intentionally false and maliciously so?
The law has been refined since 1964, and it depends on whether you're a public figure or a private individual, what standard will apply. The public figure, the public official, someone like Donald Trump, has to show that the publisher acted with reckless disregard. What that usually means is that knew it was false or entertained serious doubts. Private individual has an easier time. That person will only have to show that the newspaper was negligent.
As we heard in the clip, Trump has threatened to try to open the libel laws, as he put it, to change the burden of proof or the standard of proof. Has he gotten specific about that or taken any actions in office?
Not that I'm aware of. And the great thing about that clip, as I say in the book, is that that's a more or less textbook definition of what the law currently is. If you intentionally defame somebody, do a hit piece, yeah, you can sue and you can win. I wouldn't give him an A for diction if he wrote it in my class, maybe more in the B- range.
Have Trump or people on his behalf or in his orbit ever sued the New York Times during this era?
I've been there since 2002. He's not sued the New York Times. He sued one of our writers for a book, sued the publisher and sued the writer, didn't sue the Times.
Can the Times sue Trump for saying fake news and failing New York Times, both things demonstrably false and malicious?
I get asked that a lot. And as a general matter, we really don't want to be out there making the libel laws stronger for plaintiffs. We would prefer to win this one out in the marketplace of ideas.
Here's audio of a moment you cite in the book. It's Senator Amy Klobuchar asking a question of then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Now, spoiler alert, folks, the Attorney General does not promise not to imprison journalists for doing their job.
Will you commit to not putting reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Well, I don't know that I can make a blanket commitment to that effect, but I would say this. We've not taken any aggressive action against the media at this point, but we have matters that involve the most serious national security issues that put our country at risk, and we will utilize the authorities that we have legally and constitutionally if we have to.
Okay.
Maybe we always try to find an alternative way, as you probably know, Senator Klobuchar, to directly confronting media person, but that's not a total blanket protection.
So he did get specific there about circumstances under which they would go after journalists, but why did you include that in the book?
Jeff Sessions was very confused about the law there, and let me just say, I know that shocks people in the audience. He's confusing two things. One is when the government comes after a source in the government and then turns to the newspaper or the newspaper reporter to find out who that was. We've used an anonymous source, and we've seen that in the past where reporters have gone to jail to protect a source. That's not a matter of the reporter having done something criminal. Senator Klobuchar, I think, was really asking whether he intended to apply the Espionage Act to the reporter herself or himself. That has never been done. The Espionage Act has been around for more than 100 years, never applied to a publisher, never applied to a broadcaster, and America should keep it that way.
How much do you disagree with the exceptions that he was trying to lay out in that sort of, nuance is too strong a word, but he was trying to, say not as a blanket thing, I can't say we'll never arrest a journalist because they may do this or they may do that.
If he's talking about going after anonymous sources, we get a lot of protection under the Justice Department regulations. They've worked in the main. They don't work all the time. And I understand that we're not going to win that fight in Congress. Congress is always going to think there should be some sort of balance set. But here's the thing that I would say, because most leak investigations are not about protecting national security. They're about silencing reporting that the government doesn't like. So to the extent that those exceptions are being used not for the good cause of protecting national security, but for the really terrible cause of silencing the press, I hate to see them misused that way.
Have they tried to use those tools at all?
That's the interesting thing. In the time that I've been at the Times, we had a case that many people will remember. Judy Miller was pursued for her source. And one of our reporters, Jim Risen, was pursued for his source for a book, not for work he did for the Times. But in the last 9 years, 10 years now, whenever there's been a leak investigation, there's been several, the government has never come to us. The government has been able to make its case, thanks to electronic media, by looking for the employee within government and not coming to us to see if our reporter could be compelled to testify.
Listeners, you can call up and ask a question of New York Times Deputy General Counsel David McCraw. His new book is called Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. And audience here in the Greene Space, raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. You write that as a libel lawyer, you're paid to vet New York Times stories before publication. How does that process usually work?
We don't vet as many stories as most people think. There are magazines that continue to vet every story. The New Yorker, I think that's the procedure. I usually look at somewhere between 10 and 20 stories a week. Sometimes they're videos now, of course, sometimes they're audio. And it can work in a variety of ways. I can become involved with a story very early on, even while it's being reported, because somebody has a question about access to information. Can we sue to get some information? Can we sue to get some documents? Or, as sometimes happens, I will receive a story by email, and I will say, what's your deadline? And the answer is, just as soon as you finish reading. I prefer something that's a little closer to the beginning of reporting than the moment that they're about to put it online.
There's a basic culture clash there between the way journalists work and the way lawyers work.
Exactly right.
But you wrote also that as a libel lawyer, a little sympathy for the villain is almost a requirement. What's an example of that?
Well, when I receive a story, and I use the election as an example, I always try to see it through the eyes of whoever the person is that is the subject of that suit. What is it that person reading it, frankly unfairly, is going to try to put together as the case that something's wrong with the story? And this comes up all the time, every time I do it. And what's interesting is a lot of media lawyers wrote to me over the last couple of days since that op-ed appeared and said, thank you for articulating what we do. It comes up in terms of the Me Too stories. The person who is the subject of that story, what have we done to make sure we had this right? If that person's lawyer calls me, what is it I can say to say, look, I am confident we have this story nailed down? That is really, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do. It's not the legal standard. I don't need to worry about whether we acted with reckless disregard of the truth. We are working with complete regard for the truth, whether we're lawyers or journalists.
You used as an example in your op-ed readers' unhappiness with an article in November 2016 that was a profile of Steve Bannon. Why did you draw attention to that piece?
Well, I always live to regret it when I call attention to that, but I'm going to try this. I thought that our reporter, Scott Shane, who is one of the truly gifted reporters at our Washington bureau, had done a superb job doing this profile of Bannon. He laid out what a quirky course to right-wing politics Bannon had taken. Been in the Navy, been at Harvard Business School. People at Harvard Business School remember him as a competitive but decent colleague, as a classmate. He also talked, Scott did, of the atrocious politics that Steve Bannon had promoted at Breitbart News. And I thought that that's what we should do. Put it all out there. Let somebody, that is you, the reader, decide. That was not the reaction for many people. We received a lot of complaints about normalizing. We received a lot of complaints about legitimizing. I just don't see it that way. I'm an old school believer in the idea that we can trust our readers. They're going to get it right more often than not. Let them make up their own minds.
And you cite a clip from the NRA leader, Dana Loesch, from, I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, but from NRA TV, and I'm going to play the clip. It's 25 seconds. And listeners, you will hear why some at the Times took this as a threat to their safety.
Consider this the shot across your proverbial bow. We're going to fisk the New York Times and find out just what deep rich means to this old gray hag, this untrustworthy, dishonest rag that has subsisted on the welfare of mediocrity for 1, 2, 3 more decades. We're going to laser focus on your so-called honest pursuit of truth. In short, we're coming for you.
What'd you write about that clip?
You know, Brian, if somebody's in their car and just turned on your show, they're going to say, NPR is going places they didn't used to go.
That's right. NRA radio.
I find that very disturbing. I don't like it, and as a individual, as a human being, as a citizen, and I certainly don't like it to the extent that it's designed to scare people that I care about. That's my colleagues at the New York Times, as well as other journalists. As a First Amendment lawyer, though, I have to look at that and say, as I say in the book, slithered right up to the line and didn't cross it.
Line of what?
Well, between what's legal and what's illegal, what becomes a threat in this country under the First Amendment, what doesn't. The First Amendment that protects us to do world-class journalism also protects speech that's hateful, speech that's offensive. There is a line that can be crossed, And we have people who don't know where that line is, and we have brought in the police at times to deal with the increasing number of threats that our reporters receive. But when it's advocacy like that, the First Amendment says, let's hear it.
Let's take a phone call. Line 1, Ann in Park Slope. You're on WNYC with New York Times Deputy Legal Counsel David McCraw. Hi, Ann.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Mr. McCraw. How are you?
Good morning.
My question is actually regarding a current case that's taking place with a grand jury in Washington, D.C. regarding Chelsea Manning, who has recently been put back in prison for refusing to testify against her failure to disclose leaks regarding Julian Assange. My question is, what do you feel about the investigation of WikiLeaks and the ramifications of free press should these prosecutions continue to take place?
Thank you, Ann.
I'm going to start with a lawyerly distinction here, and that is that the work that Julian Assange did and the information he received from Private Manning in 2010, when we published stories about Iraq, Afghanistan, and the State Department, was work that I think should be protected just the way any other news outlet is protected. I'm not going to get into what happened with the Democratic National Convention leaks. I just don't know enough about what Julian Assange was up to. It may be that that's just legitimate reporting, or it may be something that's more troubling than that.
We'll wait for the Mueller report, and then we'll have you back.
Okay, all right. So I am not happy to see this particular leak investigation, because the Manning documents were those documents that we used, The Guardian used, or Spiegel used. I think we learned as a country a great deal about how the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq was being conducted, and I think that was important to know.
Is WikiLeaks, as it asserts it is, a news organization, in your opinion, protected by all the laws that protect news organizations?
We obviously discussed this a lot in 2010, and to us, WikiLeaks was a source, and that was an important distinction we wanted to make, that we kept our distance. We actually got into a pitched battle with WikiLeaks, which thought that we were disrespecting what they were up to and so forth. When I actually look at their site in those years, and when I try to distinguish what WikiLeaks was doing in 2010 from what The Guardian was doing, what The New York Times was doing, I can't do that. I think what they were engaged in was journalism. And that's what I come back to is I think it's a false premise to say, is Julian Assange a journalist? I think in today's world, with the way the media is, you ask, is that journalism? Is it journalism that should be protected? And if what is happening is journalism, then the law should stand up.
So 2016, DNC hacks, if they did receive hacked documents and release them to politically help Trump hurt Clinton, is that in a different legal category for you than the Private Manning case?
It's more a matter, Brian, of how much coordination there would have been, for instance, with Russians. Look, I came up at the Daily News, and the leaks then were usually for celebrities and about celebrities and by the celebrities sometimes themselves. And we didn't really care about the motivation then. And for most of our political journalism, the same is true. We don't care about the motivation. What we care about is whether this is information that the public should have. So when I look at this question of hacking, I think it's difficult because hacking is illegal. I don't like the fact that state actors are jumping in. But at the end of the day, I think our editors need to make a decision. Is this important? And if it's important for Americans to know, they're going to publish it.
We're almost out of time, but somebody's hand went up here in the Greene Space. Make it real quick, okay?
I'm going to make it real quick. I have not read your book, Mr. Craw, but I have read the op-ed, and based on that and what you have said today, I have a feeling that you are walking this fine line in your job between issuing legal opinions and opinions about ethical behavior or human decency. You're more almost like, the ethicist, right, at the New York Times. So what do you think, based on your about your profession. What gives you the mandate to decide what's decent for the New York Times to do versus what's legal for the New York Times to do?
And I'm going to give a quick answer, Brian. I don't think of myself as the fairness police. I think of myself as the fact cop. And I don't really want to get into ethical issues when I'm talking to journalists, because I want them to understand what my role is to make sure that we've written as truthful story as we can. When I'm asked about fairness, I will go there, but my job is really more on the fact side.
So bottom line, in our last 30 seconds, how's freedom of the press holding up so far in the alternative facts era?
Our people are working really hard to make sure that it still counts, and if people keep buying, keep reading, we're going to be okay.
Please thank New York Times Deputy General Counsel David McCraw. His new book is called Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. The Brian Lehrer Show in the Greene Space was produced by Lisa Allison, Mary Croak, Zoe Azalea, Amina Cerna, and Jeremy House, with the head of live radio, Megan Ryan. That was Matt Morando at the audio controls. Audience, thank you so much for coming to the Greene Space today, and thanks everybody for listening.